developed areas, we need to have a better, stronger connection between those land use decisions and the impacts they have on groundwater. And then there was a discussion earlier about LAFCO. In areas where we don't have local or existing local or regional groundwater management agencies, we need to provide authorization to LAFCO to provide technical assistance and expedited timeline to facilitate the formation of the agencies. We can't get locked down into, you know, kind of the typical LAFCO process. We've talked plenty about funding, and so I'll just hit a couple of highlights here. Whoops, I'm not sure how that happened. Aqua believes that funding is kind of a portfolio of approaches, including use of the budget through the drought components, through local fee-based approaches that would be adopted by the local agencies, through the water bond. Aqua remains very much opposed to the imposition of a statewide fee, we think, or public goods charge for water. We think these are really best addressed locally and regionally, and that point is made in the report. We get to backstop authority, and again, there's been plenty of discussion about that. The Aqua model is that in cases where there's no local management agency formed within a defined time frame, and I don't think we make a recommendation as to what that time frame should be, or in cases where that entity forms but fails to develop a compliant groundwater management plan within defined timelines, and our recommended timeline is 5 years for high and medium prioritized basins, or the entity fails to meet the performance objectives that are set forth in its approved plan. So your plan says, here's what we're going to do over the next 20 years, and at the end of the 5th year you fail, that the state board should have authority to and direction to conduct a hearing, have a public process, and then at the results of that hearing, either issue an order to a qualified local regional agency to take over or to assign a qualified third party the responsibility. That may not be exact and perfect, but I think there's a recognition that there's an important role for the state board to have here in creating both that incentive, you know, the threat that's been discussed earlier, but also, you know, a clear pathway to get to sustainability in some of these more difficult basins. Last recommendation, and Tim will probably want to speak a little bit more on this, is just the recognition that this is an integrated discussion. This is not and cannot just be about groundwater, and so we need to look at this more holistically, recognize the importance of surface water and the reliability of that surface water as we try to protect and restore our groundwater basins. Absent that connection, I agree with Tim, there's significant economic damage and loss that will hurt this state and industries terribly, and so we need to carefully address that. We do think that both the state board and DWR should continue to review impediments and barriers to transfers and stormwater use, recycled recharge, and the facilitation of new surface and groundwater storage as we move together. So thank you.
Let me close just briefly with a couple thoughts about where Aqua intends to, thank you, where Aqua intends to go from here. First, we do intend to engage constructively in the legislature. We don't think you get where we're all trying to go without some changes in law, and we'd like that to be consistent with our vision of what we're trying to accomplish here and what we just presented. Secondly, and more important, to get back to the theme I ended on a few moments ago, is the legislative stuff will shift to my very capable legislative staff, Cindy Tuck and her team. The task force itself, we will focus them on the next phase of looking a little further out in time and try to get factual, quantitative about what kind of future do we want to live in. And it goes very much to this issue of, are we just going to dump this in the laps of the locals, or is it part of a statewide comprehensive plan? 35 years ago, I was writing a PhD dissertation on groundwater law and management in California. One of the lessons I learned there is all groundwater basins go to equilibrium eventually. Equilibrium is an economist term, which I happen to be. It's going to happen. We can shape what that equilibrium looks like. You're going to get sustainable outcomes. It may be a sustainable outcome with an economy that has withered away and with streams that no longer carry water and won't supply left. That's sustainable. And what goes, you can't get out what didn't go in. We would assert if you leave this just to locals and all we need to worry about is making sure we put demand restrictions on groundwater. That's the sustainable outcome you're going to get eventually. If you combine this to part of a statewide, conscious statewide program, we can have sustainable outcomes with a robust economy on the overlying land and a healthy ecosystem. It's going to be our choice, but we want to emphasize that that choice goes way beyond what we're recommending here today. It goes to the state government sticking to the leadership you've committed to make sure that this is not the only thing that gets done in California water, that we do invest in storage, we do fix the delta, we do manage demands in our cities and on our farms, and then this can be a very important part of that overall statewide program. We'd be glad to answer any questions.
Very good. Good presentation, and I'll turn it over to my panel members for questions and comments.
Thanks.
First, I really want to thank you and compliment you on this. When I first read it, I was very surprised, and I think
I think a lot of people.
I really do recognize the amount of work and courage that it took to put this to paper, so thank you for that. And on your last and overarching point on kind of the role of the state in a sustainable way, and given where the state has recently come from and the governor's leadership on Prop 30 and getting more California taxpayers to pay for all of the state's public goods, including water, I do want to understand a little bit more of where Aqua comes from being opposed to the public goods charge as a form of sustainable funding for the state's role and for local role. So I think we are really examining how we can be a sustained role, and as you know, the general fund is not often that sustainable.
I think we're showing here that we're not inalterably opposed to all fees. If a fee has a purpose that makes sense to us, we're prepared to take heat from our members and move forward and propose that. There is a virtually universal concern in our community that our agencies, our local agencies, will be turned into general fund surrogates by a legislature that doesn't have the courage to raise the revenue for statewide benefit that it should. Our view is this is a classic example, something that goes to something that will improve a sub-basin. They should be prepared to write checks to help make that happen, and we're prepared to be part of that. But to the extent you are talking about something that has true statewide benefit, we have a very strong view that that should be paid for out of the general fund, and not out of a surrogate fee on water. So we'd like to continue working with you to raise money where it's appropriate for us to do, and then encourage the state government to pay for that portion of things which go to true statewide benefits, and we think the best way to pay for that is through the general fund. Dave?
So I'm interested to understand too how the state backstop piece would work if you have multiple entities managing in one sub-basin.
Yeah, good question, and it's one that Lester and I continue to debate. The short answer to your question is if there's going to be a coordinated cooperative agreement amongst multiple agencies within a sub-basin, there's probably going to have to be designation of the responsible entity, or alternatively, all of the entities have to agree that if they've got one bad actor among them, that whatever the backstop is that it's applied is going to apply to all. And that creates some concern amongst some of the water user community that, gosh, if I'm doing my best and my neighbor refuses to, I really don't want to get drugged down. The challenge here in trying to figure this out is I've heard people say that it's not so, in fact, maybe it was you, Debbie, who said, I don't really care how you get there, I just want to make sure that you get there. And in some cases, we have existing local groundwater management entities within a subbasin who have come together or are on the verge of coming together to coordinate monitoring and management activities and to derail them into saying, well, now we got to create a new entity with a, a new set of criteria, I fear puts us into a place where we're spending a lot of time in process and not time on creating successes. The other fear is that it may very well just lead to, a faster pathway to conflict and potentially court action, which I don't think any of us want to see. So my interest is in trying to figure out how we can preserve as much flexibility within this model to allow places where we do have entities that are willing to come together and kind of manage cooperatively, that they are allowed to do that. Now, with that maybe comes, again, some designation of either lead or a requirement that if you're going to do that, you're all jointly and unseverably liable, right, or responsible for the management of that subbasin.
Yeah, no, my question was along the same lines, and Debbie may have also said it, but I know I keep saying, I don't care how you do it, I just think you need to do it. And part of my thinking has been, what is the lightest touch possible that creates an incentive but gets movement? And so just trying to figure out how this might work. I mean, it also strikes me as possible in one of those patchwork areas where there's some coordination and there's an area that just doesn't want to come in, that you could actually also have a more tactical backstop role for the state in some way, shape, or fashion. But I want to commend you, Lester, well, everybody actually, for putting in the thinking to put more meat on the bones or substance to this dialogue, which is evolving really rapidly. I echo Martha's comment that it requires courage in the historical context, and I think there's a lot of that going around with people just realizing that if we all engage in this, we can sort of figure it out. So I just want to thank you for that, and I could ask you a zillion questions, but I'll sit down and do that with you later. This is just great food for thought along an alignment that seems pretty consistent, even though the devil will be in the details of helping us think about how to do it. The one question that just maybe isn't the biggest question, but struck me is, when you're talking about this frame of this backstop role, it seems analogous in some part to the sort of adjudication light that the Water Foundation suggests, like a different form of the same thing, or am I misreading it? Just different flavor of the same idea, knowing that we don't want to necessarily develop a massive new cadre of either ALJs or others, but trying to figure out where there's a need to step forward, how to tactically get the resources together to see that somebody, I mean, the whole principle of the threat of going in, which is much more established between the federal and state governments on environmental statutes, is that you want to be prepared to go in, but your goal is not to come in. Your goal is to be an incentive and an assistant, with the goal being just to get something done. So you're both stepping in for the public in the case that the locality just can't get it together for whatever reason, and you're creating the threat. So there's some insurance or assurance, whichever word you want to use, that things will move as opposed to staying in a bad stasis. But is there a conflict I'm not seeing between?
No.
Okay.
I don't think so at all. We hadn't thought of the concept of adjudications that were administrative. I mean, the adjudication, some people love them, mostly lawyers. Some people don't. I came to view them many, many years ago as being a good way to put a straitjacket on an agency. Down in Orange County, they would never adjudicate because they wanted to work their basin a lot more than they thought an adjudication would allow them. But the biggest problem with adjudications is transactions costs. They take a long time. They are really expensive. But at their heart, they're a little market mechanism that any economist can warm up to, or they put a limit on pumping. They let you trade. They let you trade the pumping back and forth. Yeah. And if you could find some way that you could go to that market type basis of system, if that's what works for an area, and knock the transactions cost way down, that would be good. I did want to quickly point out on the previous question about what do you do if there are some holdouts that don't want to go along with the plan. We are addressing that as best we can on page 6 in the last sentence in 3A. I mean, and this is a pretty hard line. This was, by the way, this was really fiercely debated amongst the task force members. This was not an easy issue, but they came to a unanimous agreement that you can't let people opt out. Everybody has got to be playing. And if you don't opt into the local program, this sentence says, well, then you'll be required to do your own program, and it will be under the jurisdiction of the state board. And that was controversial, and probably still is controversial. But from our perspective, you can't make it easy for people to opt out of dealing with the common pool problem, because they will.
On the topic of the white spots, places without governance, I think there was something in your materials that suggested that they might be annexed into a neighboring jurisdiction, and I was wondering if that's right, and if you had some sort of proposal for how to do that that's novel, or would it just go through a LAFCO process? Is there any new thinking on that?
No, the recommendation was, and that same recommendation that Tim just read from, is that, you know, the groundwater management agency should be authorized to incorporate into its existing plan neighboring areas overlying its subbasin not already covered. I've had some attorneys ask me if that's even legal, and so I guess if we write it into statute, we can make it legal, but or arguably legal. But no, and actually there's been some discussion in other venues about, you know, what would the process for that be, and do you have some kind of takeover provisions, and how does that coincide with this suggestion that even there, if they rejected, then you go back to the recommendation that Tim made, or the observation that Tim made, well, the state board can just own them. We don't have any great ideas on that process yet, but I think it is important and kind of consistent with the earlier discussion about recognizing that these basins are not as strictly defined as presented in Bulletin 118, and we need to have a process for working through DWR to provide data that would suggest a modification of that boundary, and maybe along with that comes a modification of the groundwater management plan's coverage area.
Great. Yes, Maurice.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I'll have to say it's immeasurably encouraging to see the proposal from Aqua. It's I read it on a plane last week going to LA, and I think it's the first time I've felt better getting off a plane than I felt getting on the plane. But real compliments to your board and the leadership for recognizing that we need to fix this for the betterment of all water users. And really pleased to see the recognition of groundwater surface water interaction there, and these issues of water availability determination and groundwater plan consistency determinations, I think, are really powerful and important points to keep in mind. Driving to a question, I have a number of them, but I'll stick to one for the purposes of time, and that is you and also the proposal that California Water Foundation included suggest prioritizing in some way based on the DWR prioritization list, which covers a fairly small fraction, a third or less of the overall basins. And so I can see the rationale for doing that, but my question is it essential that we do that, recognizing that there are many other basins that may not have met some of the criteria for population and overdraft and other things that factored into DWR's prioritization process that support locally very important uses, human uses, and habitats. Just an example, there's the 500 or so basins, there's 161 of them that we estimate support anadromous fisheries, support the streams in which anadromous fisheries live, and 90 of those are ranked low or very low on the DWR prioritization list. So is it essential that we postpone or forego active management in those areas immediately, or is there a way that we can include those so that we can proactively manage before conditions erode further? Thanks.
The discussion in the task force was really one of it was a business approach, is let's focus on the areas that need attention. And the best tool that we could come up with as the measurement was the CASGIM prioritization criteria. The task force did not discuss specifically, that I recall, although I've been in a million discussions, so maybe they did, this notion of whether or not those criteria were sufficient. The task force did specifically, and it is provided in here, believe that this should be a statewide framework that's applicable to all. And we fiercely debated, as Tim used that frame, or that phrase, whether or not this framework should be limited in its application and its scope, and ultimately said, no, this should apply to everybody. And those who are doing well should be able to step up and say, we're doing well, so we're in compliance, and those that aren't, you know, need to step up, whether they're high or low priority. Although we didn't set specific timelines in our recommendations for low priority basin compliance, just an encouragement provision. Now, that being said, I think the spirit of the task force, particularly given the recognition of the surface groundwater issue, would be supportive of, you know, where the foundation was at in evaluating whether or not that criteria is sufficient, and maybe highlighting some otherwise not designated medium or high priority basins because of their ecosystem significance, and including them early on in a compliance schedule.
So yeah, I mean, I also want to echo, this is an amazing set of recommendations, really well thought out, a lot of really excellent recommendations and details. And I guess I want to emphasize the, I was glad to see some, a lot of inclusion of the need for transparency and transparent data and an open process. I think also the inclusion of water quality in here within the plans, I was really happy to see. I think there could be some more recognition of the need for the state role's involvement just from technical review and involvement in terms of support for plans on the water quality side as well. But so I guess there's two things maybe to highlight questions around. One is, there's been some challenges with trying to make sure that, groundwater management and water management planning in general can be truly inclusive and representative of many different interests in the basin. And I'm wondering, this seems to just allow existing water agencies to use their existing representation structures and not allow necessarily any kind of voting seats or decision-making ability by groups that may not be represented, or interests that may not be represented by existing water agencies. So specifically, maybe disadvantaged communities. I know environmental interests are as well. And I'm wondering if you have if that was something that was discussed, and how you see that playing into this.
Well, let me set a contextual comment, and then Dave can talk in a little more detail. Our intent here is to be as flexible as possible about how governance happens at the local level. So we didn't want to be prescriptive at all about what should or should not happen. We were more interested in the outcomes of the governance decisions than the actual governance mechanisms. So we're trying here to create as flexible as possible an approach to where the locals are allowed to shape their own vision of how they want to accomplish transparency and governance and all those things. Dave?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, recommendation 4I speaks about the potential governance options, which may include, but are not limited to, your traditional JPA, IRWM, newly created special district, other appropriate local or regional entity, or even an MOU amongst the existing agencies. All of those are full of a million different questions about representation, and I understand that issue. We've worked carefully and extensively on trying to enhance environmental justice and environmental representation through our local integrated regional water management planning process. And the challenge is that some of the risk management strategies for local agencies who formed these new agreements encourage the formation of new joint powers interests or agencies where you can separate as a risk management strategy, some of the risks and exposures, and JPAs are commonly used, but as you well know, do not allow non-government agencies a seat on governance. I think that's something that we'd be willing to carefully consider and discuss on how you do that. I think Lester had suggested that perhaps that's a modification in the future that would be worth talking about. The reality, though, to recognize two things. One is the adoption of a groundwater management plan under the SB 1938 standard requires a significant amount of public input and public hearing and public consideration. It also requires a very open and transparent annual review of your plan and a report, and would be done by a public agency that's subject to public input through the Brown Act. The entities that typically govern these plans are entities that are, that are represented by elected individuals who are elected either at large or within a division or a district to represent that constituency. So there's a significant amount of public input and access and voice in not only plan development but ongoing governance that needs to be considered if we're going to talk about creating additional.
I have a second question, but I can wait till if there's time.
We're ready to move on, but I want to counsel you as a good friend that, and I'm glad, Dave, that you made the comment that if you could rewrite this, you would put some emphasis on the property rights issue that Lester brought up. I think that to the extent that your outreach is really sitting down with the farm and ranch community, and I know that water districts represent them, and oftentimes as farmers and ranchers, we delegate you as our spokespersons on water issues. But when we start to have documents that stress so much potential extraction limits or indicating that certain kinds of crops shouldn't go in, I think that we, to the extent that you, as the leaders that you are, reach out to that community and include them in how we approach this property rights issue, for everyone to know that the farmers and ranchers over the last 30 years have been planting higher value crops for market signals, but those market signals are being driven by people in this world who finally have discretionary income to feed their families better, and that what's being planted is part of that nutritional diet part, and that's why it's so important for us to get this groundwater thing right, is that we want to continue to feed the world more nutritious food and to do it efficiently and to minimize our environmental footprint, and that to the extent that you can engage that community on this property rights issue, I think it will help all of us get to some long-term solutions that really will be the right solutions going forward. Thank you for indulging me in that little sermon.
Agree, and we will do so.
Good morning. I was just recognizing this is my 37th year doing water. I think one of my first meetings was at the Water Board. It's kind of unusual for me. I've been on many panels with several of these folks, and frequently I'd either be the for or the against. And what I find interesting here is, at least in my career, the unprecedented consensus. Not just on something needs to be done. That's fairly easy. We know that in other water for. Yeah, it's broken, something's got to be done. But then the divergence is immediate on what needs to be done. And so I will commend the California Water Foundation, the beginning efforts of the Valley Ag Coalition, Aqua certainly, the governor's administration on developing something that sort of makes sense. Now, there's some details here, but let me give you the biggest point I'm going to share with you today. This is the year to do it. People say, well, what happens if it rains? Well, if it rains, some of the interest goes away. The problem does not go away. This is not a dry year only problem. This is the time to do it. It's going to require us collectively to address the issues that have been raised today and some others. Let me touch on 4 of them. Laurel and others, Martha mentioned representation. Yes, I know we have the usual public participation processes where people can come and give their 3 minutes of public comment sometimes. That's really not sufficient. This cannot be driven just by those who extract. It needs to include meaningful participation by those who benefit from the groundwater resource. The disadvantaged communities, we have human right to water as part of our law now. Those communities are the first and hardest hit. The environmental impacts that Maurice and others have talked about, the drying up of streams, needs to be represented in that. Now, how do you do that? It's going to be tough. If you have assessments, well, do people who are not paying get represented in these decisions? That's one of the important details. I think there are some precedents out there, though, when people really want to work together. LADWP, in an urban setting, has found ways to involve their publics in one of the most basic questions, rate paying, where they believe, it's my understanding, they have meaningful input into that. Right here in Sacramento, there's something called a water forum, where they have a successor effort. These are the water agencies, the cities, the counties, the NGOs who've pledged to work together for 30 years in a structured way, meeting monthly, and the worth of that has been proven in this drought circumstance where they've gotten together and kind of worked out, okay, how are we going to share the pain? The second big point is not assuming or allowing local groundwater management entities to assume that they will bring it into balance by any of these 3 methods. One would be, oh, well, we're going to assume we're going to be able to fully exercise some contractual or other entitlements. In our community, these are called paper water. So they don't get to count on paper water. Secondly, relaxing already, in our view in many cases, inadequate environmental standards. You know, okay, well, we'll just cut the flow in the lower American River. The minimum won't be 250 cubic feet per second. We'll drop it down to 100 cubic feet per second. And that's how we will balance it. The third way, and this is somewhat semantic, but it's also real. Those factors that affect bringing water into a basin. Now, my friend David will call those sometimes restrictions or impediments. We may call those protections. And so to ensure that one doesn't balance their own groundwater basin to the detriment of another watershed, surface or groundwater. The third big point I'd bring up that I think we should be working on collectively, quickly, addressing how we're going to deal with this interrelationship with water quality. 10 miles to the east of here, 50 miles east of here, there's a big plume of TCE underlying the old Rancho Cordova operations. You can't manage the groundwater without knowing how you're going to impact the movement of that plume. Now, we know that there are a whole bunch of institutions already involved in water quality. So what are the interrelationships? How do they work together? Now, let me give you the fourth one that I haven't heard directly addressed, but just thinking back when, I think I followed Bob Reeb as a water agency manager to the east of here. So you have this new groundwater management entity, okay? JPA or whatever it is. How does it work with the existing water management agencies, which may be solely surface water or a combination of surface and groundwater? So if we go back to Lester's commentary about the need to fully implement integrated water management, how do they work together? You know, you got a irrigation district, a water conservation district. They have their own plans for how they're going to use their water. Okay, so how does that work? I have cleared my calendar basically because of the work of the 4 groups here. You know, but before a couple of weeks ago, literally a couple of weeks ago, this was not worth spending time on because it wasn't happening. Nothing was going to move. With the leadership of the groups expressed here, this has moved up in our priorities, again, to make it happen in this legislative session. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, how do you top that, wanting to get action done? Questions, comments? Panel? Review panel, it's your last shot. Laurel?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I would just bring up or echo and bring up an issue around sort of the role of the state and the state backstop. You know, I think and this was somewhat in the context also of all of the proposals, is just, you know, the need to have the state be able to also see its role as, you know, certainly the assistance and technical assistance provided, but also some oversight and ability to protect those most vulnerable, and some ability to be able to petition to the state or some kind of adjudicatory proceeding when things haven't gone well on the local level. I think there is a need to make sure that the focus and incentive is there to engage at the local level first and foremost, and that needs to be where the real work is. But we also have to acknowledge that there are local politics that will always be at play and that don't necessarily allow for equitable outcomes, and there should be some ability to petition or solicit state oversight and involvement, particularly for most vulnerable communities and interests, and also to protect that floor of state interests. I also think that it's important to note, to emphasize that with the, you know, with state involvement in terms of funding and expertise, I think also comes even more of a need for transparency and access to data. And I think that this issue is such an urgent public need, public health and safety need, that to prevent access to the data and the models and the information needed to make those analyses and those decisions the best and most robust that they can be is really a responsibility the state needs to take really seriously when it's developing this. And yeah, but I guess, you know, since this is the last time we can talk, I would just say, you know, I think that the state has had just recently passed the human right to water. I would hope that within all of its decision making, it would look at many of these decisions through that lens. I think the groups here have done a really good job of thinking through very workable frameworks. I think we're all really close together in many ways, and yet there's really key details that need to be worked out that are really important for its success, and I look forward to working together, so thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
quick.
I was just going to say, you might not be done talking because I think this is a good opportunity for any cleanup questions, including questions to our review panel based on some of your comments. Maurice, were you going to say something?
Oh, no, go ahead. I can wait.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll make a few comments, more comments and reinforcement of what John has said rather than questions. I do second his emphasis that now is the time to act. And there's many reasons for that, including the drought and the awareness of what the overuse of groundwater, even in wetter years, is causing to us in this drought condition, but also the very real and physically unavoidable situation that the longer we allow continued use of groundwater, which has been accelerating in many parts of the state lately, and many of our panelists have mentioned expanded irrigated lands and intensification of irrigated water use. Anytime you increase that groundwater use, you're affecting surface flows, which affect the other 60 to 70% of our water supply, according to whose numbers you're using. And those are surface water rights and property rights represented in that as well. And so the longer that we allow the degradation or the expanded use of groundwater and the degradation of our streams to go, the more difficult it is to recover from that. So just an exclamation point on that need to act now, otherwise it's going to be more costly and more painful for those who have established water uses.
Thank you. Ken? Yes.
Just an observation as a comment. Whatever we do, and I see the thrust towards doing something, that it be well thought out, that it be well thought through, that all the different things be taken into consideration. We're talking about a state with 38 million people. A lot of the groundwater is used for cities, but also for agriculture industry, what is one of the great bases of the state, and expanding. As we said, we're feeding the world. So finding that balance is going to be tricky, but I think it can be done.
Yeah, there is a mandate that if local agencies don't take action and get something done, that the state will do it for them. I assume that's not a threat, that's something that's going to occur. But when an agency does develop a plan and put it into action, is there any oversight by the state, or will there be, that this plan is adequate and meets the criteria that you're looking for?
I think that the proposals that have come up have all included some sort of oversight, performance review, whatever it might be. So it seems to me that that is a given, but it's always important to make those points again. Felicia, I think you were getting ready to ask a question, or you had another comment. I want to give you all a chance to ask the full array of our experts here.
Yeah, I just find it interesting that there's a convergence, and I wanted to thank Jonas for flagging some of the issues that are out there where things converge, and we have to figure out how that interaction works without necessarily prescribing how we do it. And I just think those are important issues to also toss into this very heady mix, because many of them reflect some of the questions that I have gotten from legislators over a few blocks away. And so those issues will come up. So I just was going to encourage, I mean, we just lock everyone here in a room for a while and they can just work it through, because the more of that conversation that happens and the more worked through and thought out it is, as Supervisor Vogel said, as we've all been through that alliance of historically unlikely allies coming in to say, you know, there's a remarkable convergence and agreement in some areas, and here are some of those outlier issues that we need to resolve, particularly interconnections between surface and groundwater and the environmental quality issues. Those are all, obviously you don't want to pumping to mess up a plume, as opposed to seeing the opportunity to pump, treat, and serve, as you look in the San Gabriel Valley and other places. There are synergies and opportunities in that, and yet at the same time we don't want to so overcomplicate it that we're redoing the entire system. But I think if we can find that right touch or that sweet spot, we really can move this year, which would really be terrific in terms of just giving people intelligibility and the like, and doing it, as I said earlier, and this is the hard part in terms of finding the sweet spot, with the lightest touch possible that actually encourages movement. And so that's where the issue of oversight, what level of oversight do we need to make sure we're really going to move, and we're not just putting a nice plan on paper and we're all going to be sitting on our hands for 2 to 5 years. That is an issue I am a little concerned about. And how do we do it in a way that meets all of the various values and needs that people, it's a very tall order, but I'm encouraged by the convergence that I see on everybody's part, and the openness to just talking about stuff and trying to figure it out, because that doesn't always happen. It is a remarkable time.
I had a question for Supervisor Vogel. Just hearing some of the, you're in a very interesting position, because as a farmer, as a supervisor, and in San Joaquin in particular. But what, do you have any thoughts on some of the proposals that have been mentioned around land use decisions, and both the kind of will serve notion and also the consistency of general plans with groundwater management plans?
Well, I've been listening to all this today with interest because it does affect local government, and how that's going to play through some of those things I have not thought about. And I sit on a LAFCO and so forth. Exactly how that's going to be worked through, I think, is one of the challenges in this. And as my colleague on my right here said, we want to do something. If we're going to have it mandated, we're do something, we need to do something. And being able to find out what exactly that is with managing the water, managing development. We're in an area where we are trying to get in more surface water. That's why I asked the question about beneficial use with agreements with some of our entities. To get that in, to help manage, we have the conjunctive use plan we're doing. But all of that said, there are strains, especially drought brings out those strains. And as it was said by some of my other colleagues, this with groundwater is not just the whole answer. Although I may disagree with some of their other prospects, other things about we need to do storage, underground, surface and everything, has to be a whole plan. I have had people say to me 3 weeks ago, when it rained, we got 1.5 inches, drought's over. Oh, no more problems. No. This focus with the drought on groundwater, on surface water, gives us an opportunity to do something. And I think the challenge is, let's do something right, because we don't have too many chances to redo it if we don't get it right. I hope that answer goes towards answering your question.
Actually, Martha asked my question, but I have another. Maurice, I wonder if you've given any thought to the mechanism by which, or let me start over. So do you think just by managing groundwater, we resolve this problem of the surface water groundwater interaction, or do you think that there are additional things that we could do or should do to make sure that we're getting at that issue?
I think that proactive, thoughtful management of groundwater is what's necessary to deal with the issue of groundwater surface water interaction and the impacts of groundwater pumping on surface water flows and surface water rights. I think the key is going to be having an institution in place that can do the right things, and the right things include monitoring the groundwater levels in areas that are adjacent to streams, or in areas where you have groundwater dependent ecosystems like wetlands that are dependent on groundwater conditions, monitoring those levels and using modeling tools that are well established and well developed, estimating how much effect you have with that groundwater pumping on the surface water flows, and the management entity, whatever shape that takes, then incorporating it in their management plan, basin management objectives, to use the terms that we currently use, that ensure that the groundwater pumping and the groundwater management, the groundwater pumping and the groundwater recharge that occurs, maintain or don't increase the impacts on surface flows, or maintain surface flows that support the other beneficial uses of those surface flows. And so it's the details of that. There's a lot of details, but in fact they're pretty practically implementable if the local entities have the authorities and they have the guidance, and of course they have the funding to do that. And there, I could go on in specific details of how that might look in different places, but it's really a matter of having the authorities and the information that you need, and implementing it with proactive understanding of the impacts on the surface flows.
This is a follow-on question to that. It seems as though there is some consensus about how to prioritize groundwater basins, which ones need attention based on Bulletin 118 and CASGEM and all, but the surface water interaction issue is different and harder, as you pointed out, and I was wondering if you or anybody else had thoughts on how to identify where that kind of monitoring should be done, those kinds of things should be focused, because obviously it can't be done everywhere.
Well, I'll certainly respond, and I guess my first response is that it probably can be done everywhere, and probably should be done almost everywhere, and there are some exceptions where it's reasonable to say the current situation is so unaltered, or it's the level of exercise of the basin is such that you probably don't need to pay too close attention to that for a while, but we need to reassess that. Then it becomes, but other than those fairly few exceptions, it becomes a matter of, what are the funding, how much does it cost, and who is willing to and able to step up and take over those. One of the key points that we need to remember is that many of these basins that I highlighted or that I mentioned, the ones that support, that underlie and support stream flows that support anadromous fisheries, steelhead, coho, salmon, many of those are fairly small. You look at the southern end of the Central Valley, and you have one groundwater basin that's probably as big as any other, or 50 of the smaller ones. And so the level of investment and the level of energy that it takes to proactively manage those would be relatively small, especially in some of these rural areas. But, and so the investment is fairly small, but in those areas, instead of having, in some of these groundwater basins, it might take 10,000 acre feet to make a significant difference. In some of those groundwater basins, as little as 100 acre feet could make the difference between the flows in the streams being there in the summer when there's juvenile coho in the stream and not being there, or the temperatures being 80 degrees in the stream instead of 55 degrees in the stream. And so the level of investment in many of these areas to maintain a suitable condition could be very small relative to the types of investment that we're talking about, but the longer we wait to take action, the more impacts there's going to be, and the more expense it's going to take to actually manage them well and to recover them to a level that we think is suitable.
Maybe could I address his question? I think it's important that we do have I think it is important that we do have integration between groundwater agencies and people who are pumping groundwater that are outside those agencies. And we need to take a real hard look at the periphery of the irrigation districts and see what is the possibility of those districts providing water service, surface water service, to those pumpers. For example, where our district is, we have this 15, 20, 25,000 acres that are outside our district and have canals very close to where we could service that area. But while we're very well managed financially, we don't have the money to spend $25 million to enlarge our canals to go out and provide water to those people. And in addition to providing the water, we're also able to put in ponding facilities that we would recharge the ground water. But it takes money, and we're trying to have an arrangement with those property owners east of our district that they would step up and pay for a study and show that it would be financially beneficial to them, and it would be certainly beneficial to the groundwater basin to come up with a plan for us to provide that water to them, as opposed to selling that water outside the district, which provides no benefit to the local area.
I've kind of been listening to a lot of the thoughts in here, and I want to, for the department a little bit, as we've talked about 118, and I kind of look at what would a modern day 118 look like with some of the things we've discussed, and I guess I'd be interested in getting some thoughts on that.
Well, I think you've brought up a very good point, Gary, because I've seen some draft language that says update bulletin 118. What does that mean? I think we kind of have to take off the whatever the barriers and really think a lot more openly about that, because you have groundwater basins, subbasins. Well, guess what? It's all interconnected with surface water that's flowing through it. A lot of the recharge occurs along the stream beds, so you really have to start thinking in a larger capacity that they're all connected with watersheds. I've been involved with a couple of groundwater management plans that we use the watershed as the basis for the planning area and not just the basins. So I think it's really important to maybe rethink what Bulletin 118 is and how to go about doing that and characterizing that. And it probably be good to work closely with the state board on that, on the water quality side. I know that happened to some degree before, but could be a lot more integrated along with the data. And I know I know we talked recently with DWR and State Board about a web portal potential for interconnecting the databases that already exist with the National Groundwater Monitoring Network, and that might be a good avenue to start that dialogue. So,
Lester?
A couple thoughts related to 118 and also technical assistance. I mean, I would agree with Tim. Yeah, in that 118, I think needs to spend a lot more time on flow in and out of basins, you know, connections to other sub-basins, and then a better understanding of the current connection to surface water. The other thing is kind of a subcategory. It's kind of the CASGEM issue. It goes to Maurice's point of making sure that when you're prioritizing basins, we're capturing this ecosystem-dependent groundwater dependent ecosystems in these smaller basins that end up being a priority. I mean, I agree that you have some that look like they're fine now, and 2 wells could completely change the dynamic. So somehow that needs to be captured. One thing, it may be related to 118, I'm not sure, but I forgot to mention it in terms of the state's technical assistance. If you go back, there's been a lot of really high-quality journalism lately about subsidence and that type of thing in a number of different papers. And so we go back to the 70s, and there was subsidence everywhere, and we probably know groundwater overdraft was one of the major justifications for the State Water Project to put an end to groundwater overdraft. And I forget how that turned out, but it's like by the late 70s, early 80s, we started dismantling our subsidence monitoring network, the federal and the state system. That has to change. DWR and the USGS, I know funding is a problem, but we need to get the subsidence monitoring system back in place.
I just want to share a couple of tidbits of task force discussions about the Bulletin 118 subbasin issue. I mean, there was general recognition that the basin definitions, the boundaries of them are imperfect. I actually had an engineer who's been around a long, long time come to me yesterday who was involved in some of that process in the 70s, I guess, or whenever it was, and said that he was particularly instructed to argue that a particular area would be its own subbasin without any hydrologic justification. Now, that being said, I think we had people in the task force who said, well, we should just stop and redefine all of our groundwater basins and resources before we move forward, and you appreciate how extensive and costly and delaying that process would be. And so we had an argument, and I guess I prevailed in that we need to work with the foundation that we have rather than, you know, throw it out and start to define something new. We have a problem. We actually have, you know, a lot of entities that have formed around those defined basins, as imperfect as they are, and we ought to allow that process to build up. And as I mentioned earlier, we can get into processes to review and refine data to adjust boundaries. I do believe that we would be, as a state, incredibly better informed if we had some of the Bulletin 118 detail that's now 14, 15 plus years old. I often use the stored groundwater under the Kings Basin number, but it's becoming older and older and therefore less relevant. But DWR estimated 90 million acre feet under a 1 million acre region of the Kings groundwater basin. We'd all better understand today what that number is. I mean, an update to that across all of the basins would be very helpful. But I encourage us to work with the existing 118 structure.
Okay, if there are no more burning questions or comments, I want to thank you all for your participation. I want to commend you for the work that you did. I do want to single out Aqua because I know how hard it is sometimes, having run an association, to bring all parts of the state with very different operations together, and I think that you should be commended for what you have done on this and the willingness of the Water Foundation and what the Valley Ag Coalition has done to really put some pretty bold ideas on the table and to flesh them out, some with more details than others. And we very much look forward to working with each one of you. I also want to thank our response panel today. I thought you operated extraordinarily well, also very thoughtful and very helpful comments along the way. I'm giving everyone an extra 10 minutes for lunch. I hesitate to ask you to come back and start early because we announced earlier that public comment period would start precisely at 1:30, and hopefully over your lunch hour you will collect your thoughts and be able to articulate them very succinctly, and we will look forward to seeing you after lunch. Thank you.
We do back here. Well, that's my question. My understanding was that he worked. I don't know. I've got a meeting here in Sacramento. I've got a meeting at 3 in Sacramento. You're a busy guy. I'm chairman of the Delta Conservancy, so that's meeting out in West Sacramento. I wrote down that date on the 21st in Oakdale. Yeah. Who's sponsoring that?